Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. For nearly 2 decades, the name of the former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark has been linked with Iraq. He opposed the 1991 war and campaigned against the ensuing UN sanctions. He called for the impeachment of President Bush and was part of the legal defense team of the late Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Ramsey Clark has closely tracked the moral and legal issues of the unfolding tragedy in Iraq. In this episode, we'll try to find out what has motivated him to be such a consistent and continuing critic of successive U.S. governments.
And it's pitiful.
Ramsey Clark has been a strident critic of US-led wars on Iraq in 1991 and 2003. As a former US Attorney General, he has been a voice of considerable moral and legal weight. Clark called for the impeachment of former President George Bush soon after the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. He has accused the US of using depleted uranium during military operations in Iraq, a radioactive weapon which, Clark says, has caused thousands of deaths and birth deformities to Iraq's civilian population. Clark is perhaps best known for his controversial decision to be a member of the legal defense team of former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. That decision, he points out, is simply to establish historical truths. In the same way, he insists that the rule of law be applied to former Bush administration officials for their involvement in the Iraq War. 6 years on from the invasion, with American troops being withdrawn from Iraq, more human rights and civil liberty groups are echoing Ramsey Clark's call to bring those responsible for the Iraq War to justice.
And I'm delighted now to welcome from New York former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Mr. Clark, for 2 decades you have been gravitating towards Iraq. Explain to us why you opposed the 1991 war, the sanctions that followed. You were against the 2003 war. You were a member of Saddam Hussein's defense team. What attracts you to Iraq? Is it moral rectitude, trying to achieve justice, or is it that you are trying to shed light on your own country's policy?
Well, first it was events that led me there. I'd only been to Iraq twice in my life before 1990, and that was because I'd represented the PLO for a number of years, and when the PLO had to flee from Lebanon, it moved to Iraq for a brief time, and I was meeting with the leadership there on legal matters here in the United States. But once the Gulf War loomed, I became intensely concerned because I've been concerned about United States military aggression and opposed to war since I got out of the Marine Corps, you might say, back in 1946. And then it kept on coming on. I'd been asked to come there in 1990, in October probably, to see if we could resolve the conflict, to avoid it. And I went and talked with President Saddam Hussein, first time I ever met him, at his request. And then I went back during the bombing. I spent 2 weeks from February 2nd to about February 15th or 16th, driving up and down the country looking at damage to civilian life and structures, and it was just devastating. 110,000 aerial sorties and 88,500 tons of bombs in 42 days. Then the sanctions which had come out on Hiroshima Day to show how much respect we have for life, or the UN had respect for life at that time in imposing the sanctions at the insistence of the United States. And they became genocidal very quickly. People underestimated the impact on the lives of the people of Iraq and elsewhere where they're used of economic sanctions. They kill babies, they kill pregnant women, they kill elderly people, they kill sick people, and they ought to be prohibited.
If that is the case,
I
Mr.
went to
Clark,
Iraq every year.
Now 6 years after the invasion and after this war, does it make sense to revisit the issue of the legality of the war, the right and wrong? Many people say this is a mooted and academic point of view. People have moved on and serves no purpose to talk about it. As a jurist, as an American Attorney General, do you buy that argument?
No, not at all. If you want to move on to more war, you can neglect the past. But if you condone what happened in the past, you're condemned to repeat it. And that's something we cannot possibly afford. It's too late in life and too dangerous. So we've got to make people accountable for their conduct, and the most dangerous and destructive conduct that humans are capable of is war. There has to be accountability, and it has to be from the top leadership and the people who have committed the crimes themselves.
Let me walk with you through this route. Recently, there has been demonstration before the White House by some jurists as well as lawyers calling for a formal investigation of this war. Many European jurists, they are calling for a UN investigation into this war. Let us suppose finally there would be a recommendation to try the big players, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, and others. And God forbid if they ask to interview Dick Cheney or President Bush. What then?
Well, then maybe there'll be a rule of law on earth, and justice may prevail. You can't lay the responsibility on the people who are following orders of their superiors. I mean, of course, at Nuremberg we said that's not a defense, but it still doesn't mean that the superiors aren't those primarily responsible. But mere inquiries aren't enough. If there's to be integrity in the rule of law, there has to be actual prosecution. And it has to include the president, to the extent that the evidence shows that he was responsible for directing a war of aggression, which is a supreme international crime, and has been, always will be, and was so declared in the Nuremberg judgment itself.
The ace in the hole for President Bush is that this was sanctioned by the U.S. Congress, by the Senate.
Well, it's not sufficient. The Senate doesn't have the power. The whole Congress, which required, of course, the House and the Senate to enact a law, doesn't have the power to commit a war of aggression. But they didn't declare war, and the Constitution speaks in terms of the power to declare war. There's no war declared. And there was misrepresentation of the facts as to why the power should be delegated to the president to strike if he had to. So that deception is a part of the crime itself.
President Obama, as recent as last week, said he will not be prosecuting, will not be going after the lowly officers and security officers who committed torture. His Attorney General, however, said he will prosecute to the full extent of the law the policymakers. Would finally pragmatism trump justice? Would the Americans, including President Obama, says there is too much polarization in this country, I cannot allow this to go on?
Well, I'm very impressed by President Obama. I think he's a man of great intelligence and enormous human decency. He's got an impossible job, and he needs unity here. But that's not sufficient to blink at serious crimes, the most serious crimes. And the image of the United States condoning torture is an unacceptable image. We've got to end torture on the planet. There's enough misery in human life without a government, particularly one like ours, condoning torture, committing torture. So I think we have to clean out the barn.
Let us stay with the present situation we have inherited, Mr. Clark, and that is the aftermath of this 2003 war. On the eve of the war, I remember you very well. With from the top of your lung, you were saying, stop this war is going to be calamitous, and many innocent people are going to be dead. And not only that, there is no justification for the war, you said. Looking back at it, how would you see the major players, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Douglas Feith, even honorable men as Colin Powell, they played the game. Were they unwitting accomplices, or were they playing roles? Or I can't imagine as a decent man as Colin Powell being the fall guy for the others.
Well, I agree with you about Colin Powell, although I criticized him severely in the Gulf War, where he said he didn't care about the body count because each body is a human life and you have to count, you know. He wasn't interested, he said, in how many Iraqis died, but he was a decent man. But you can't say all of them had the same frame of mind. The thing that was absolutely clear to anyone who had any knowledge about the situation is that Iraq was not a danger to anyone. It had been blasted off the map in the Gulf War. It had suffered under the sanction. Hundreds of thousands of lives had already been lost. It's true, most were children under the age of 5. They weren't able to fight yet, but in their time. But the fact remains that it was incapable of conducting a war of aggression or hurting anybody. It needed help. It needed external help. It couldn't get medicine for its sick. And the idea that it was a danger to anybody, and then they fabricate this business about weapons of mass destruction. We have weapons of mass destruction, for God's sake. We're creating more right now. We have new generations.
Explain to me the word they fabricated.
Combined.
Explain to me the word fabricated this evidence. Exactly what do you mean?
They fabricated the public illusion that there may be weapons of mass destruction there. Whether anyone really believed, if someone believed that there were weapons of mass destruction there, he just didn't have the facts or understand. But it was clear before before we struck after 9/11 and what we call shock and awe, which is a paraphrase for terrorism when you think about it, we knew perfectly well they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but we wanted to create sufficient fear that it would justify the attack. And certainly Bush knew that, and certainly Cheney knew that, and certainly the military command knew that. One of the saddest days in our history was the day that Colin Powell appeared before the United Nations and tried to justify all these things, but he was a soldier doing his assigned duty, and yes. It was a pity.
Ramsey Clark, thank you very much. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, I'm going to ask the former U.S. Attorney General about his explanation. What lies behind the war? What was the ultimate game? Stay with us.
Mr. Clark should ask himself the appropriateness of a former American Attorney General appearing as a defense lawyer for Saddam. Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State.